The desert wind howls across empty plains. A lone tumbleweed rolls past a weathered wooden sign that reads, "Welcome to Redemption Creek, population 247." The year was 1882. In the desolate corners of New Mexico territory, where the law was as scarce as water in August, there stood a town that history would rather forget. This is the story of Sheriff William Crane, a man whose badge meant something entirely different than anyone suspected. The sound of hoofbeats echo through dusty streets. A figure on horseback approaches, silhouetted against the setting sun. People said Crane was the best lawman the territory had ever seen. In 3 years, he'd cleaned up Redemption Creek. Cattle rustlers vanished. Stage robbery stopped. The town prospered, but prosperity, like desert rain, often hides deeper truths beneath its surface. The jingle of spurs on wooden planks. A jail cell door creaks open. On the morning of May 15th, Deputy Marshal James Hartford rode into town with questions. Questions that would unravel everything. He arrived with the authority of the territorial office, demanding to speak with the sheriff about peculiar patterns he'd noticed in his reports. Horsehooves stop. Boots hit the ground with authority. Hartford wasted no time getting to the point. Redemption Creek had reported 0 arrests in 6 months. No crimes. Nothing. Meanwhile, 3 towns over, stages were being robbed weekly. Hartford carried a list of known outlaws who'd all disappeared after their trails led toward Redemption Creek. The Dalton Gang, Blackjack Morrison, Maria Cortez, known as the Santa Fe Sparrow, all vanished like smoke. Crane remained calm, suggesting that perhaps his reputation had simply scared them off. But Hartford had been a lawman for 15 years. He knew criminals didn't just avoid a place out of fear. They tested it. They probed for weaknesses. They always tried. Footsteps echo in the sheriff's office. Papers rustling. Hartford wasn't wrong to be suspicious. What he didn't know was that 10 miles outside town, hidden in a box canyon the locals called Devil's Throat, there was a camp. A camp where the most wanted men and women in the West lived under one condition: stay away from Redemption Creek, and the sheriff wouldn't come looking. The crackle of a campfire. Low voices murmuring in the distance. That very evening, while Hartford slept at the boarding house, Crane rode out under cover of darkness. It was Wednesday. Wednesday was collection day. A horse whinnies. Leather creaks as someone dismounts. In the flickering firelight of the outlaw camp, Crane conducted his business with the efficiency of a shopkeeper. Dalton handed over $300 from stage robbery in Colorado. Clean job, no one hurt. That was the rule. Maria Cortez and Blackjack Morrison stood nearby, reminding the sheriff that they remembered the agreement. No violence. No jobs within 50 miles. They were ghosts. And in return, Crane kept the Federals off their backs. He didn't come looking. He let them be. But now there was a problem. Marshal Hartford was asking questions. Sudden tension. Guns being checked. Dalton suggested they could take care of Hartford permanently, but Crane shut that down immediately. That was the line they didn't cross. Hartford was a good man doing his job. Violence against lawmen would bring the full weight of territorial justice down on them all. So what were they supposed to do? It was a fair question. The arrangement had worked because of its simplicity. Crane looked the other way. The outlaws paid him a percentage of their distant jobs, and Redemption Creek thrived in genuine peace. The town's merchants grew rich. Children played safely in streets. It was a paradise built on a lie. Back in town, morning birds chirping, door opening. The next morning, Hartford confronted Crane with the sheriff's own records. The incident reports stopped abruptly 3 years ago. Too abruptly. Hartford explained that in 15 years of law work, he'd never seen criminals simply avoid a town. They didn't work that way. Crane poured coffee and insisted he was simply that good at his job. Hartford suggested he was good at a different job entirely. Footsteps approaching quickly. Door bursts open. Breathless voices. Before the tension could escalate further, a townsman rushed in with news of a shooting at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Both men rushed to the scene. Footsteps running. Crowd murmuring anxiously. The chaos at the saloon would prove to be Crane's undoing. A traveling card dealer lay bleeding on the floor. Standing over him with a smoking gun was someone Crane recognized immediately. Young Tommy Dalton, son of the gang leader, barely 18 years old. The boy was panicked, insisting the dealer had been cheating, that he hadn't meant to shoot. Hartford ordered the boy to put the gun down. But then Crane made a mistake. He started to say that Tommy was supposed to be somewhere else, somewhere specific. Hartford caught it immediately. The marshal's eyes moved from Tommy to Crane and back again, pieces falling into place like cards in a poker hand. The sheriff knew this boy, knew where he was supposed to be. The young outlaw, confused and in pain, started to say something about the sheriff's promises, about being safe if they follow the rules. Hartford pressed him to finish that sentence. Jail cell bars rattling. Tense silence broken by quiet conversation. The next hours moved like a runaway train. Hartford arrested Tommy Dalton and began pressing him with questions. The boy, scared and young, started talking. Names spilled out. Locations. Dates. And at the center of it all, Sheriff William Crane. Before Hartford wired his report to Santa Fe, he needed to understand something. He confronted Crane in private, asking the question that had been burning in his mind. Why? Crane had been a decorated officer with commendations. Why throw it all away? Long pause. Heavy sigh. Crane explained that when he'd arrived in Redemption Creek, the town was dying. Businesses were closing. Families were leaving. The previous sheriff had been killed by the same outlaws Crane later made his deal with. He'd become practical, he said. He'd given the town peace. Real peace. No gunfights in the streets. No widows. No orphans. Mothers slept soundly knowing their children were safe. Hartford called it corruption. Crane called it compromise. Those outlaws were going to rob and steal anyway. At least his way kept the violence far from Redemption Creek. At least this way, children weren't caught in crossfire. Hartford asked about the money. Crane admitted that half went to town improvements. The new schoolhouse was built with blood money. So was the church bell. The rest he'd saved to disappear someday, to start fresh somewhere and find his own redemption. Papers shuffling. Pen scratching on paper. Hartford made his decision. By law, Crane had to face justice. But Hartford was also practical. He'd seen what happened when good intentions met bad circumstances. He would arrest Crane, but he'd also recommend leniency. The camp at Devil's Throat would be raided, every outlaw brought in. But Hartford would give them a choice first. Turn themselves in, cooperate, and he'd argue for reduced sentences. Some might even avoid the rope. Crane warned that they'd fight. Hartford said he'd have the army there by weeks and if necessary. But he wanted to try peaceful surrender first. Crane seemed surprised that Hartford would offer any mercy at all. The marshal explained that he'd seen worse arrangements in the territory. At least Crane's had kept people alive. That counted for something. Not enough to let him walk free, but something. Horses approaching. Multiple riders. Commands being shouted. The raid on Devil's Throat happened 3 days later. To everyone's surprise, the outlaws didn't fight. Dalton, Maria Cortez, Black Jack Morrison, they all surrendered peacefully. Perhaps Crane's influence had changed them more than anyone realized. Perhaps they were just tired of running. Either way, not a single shot was fired. Courtroom sounds, gavel banging, papers rustling. The trials took place in Santa Fe over the course of 2 months. The newspapers called it the most unusual case in territorial history. William Crane stood before the judge, his badge now evidence in a box rather than pinned to his chest. The judge acknowledged that both the prosecution and defense were correct. Crane had betrayed his oath, but he'd also protected his community. The law wasn't meant to bend to convenience, no matter how noble the intention. However, Hartford's testimony, combined with letters from every citizen of Redemption Creek pleading for mercy, couldn't be ignored. Crane received 5 years in territorial prison with eligibility for parole after 2. Gavel bangs. Murmuring crowd slowly disperses. As for the outlaws, their fates varied. Dalton got 10 years for past crimes, but would be eligible for release in 5 with good behavior. Maria Cortez, who'd never been connected to any violence, received 3 years. Black Jack Morrison, with murder charges hanging over him from years past, wasn't as fortunate. He would hang in the spring. Prison sounds. Doors locking. footsteps echoing down stone corridors. Crane served 18 months before parole. The governor, influenced by public opinion and Hartford's continued advocacy, decided the former sheriff had paid enough for his sins. When Crane walked out of that prison in the spring of 1884, he found Hartford waiting with 2 horses. The marshal explained he'd been thinking. In all his years of law work, he'd seen hundreds of towns barely hanging on, terrorized by men with guns and no conscience. But Redemption Creek had thrived under Crane's protection, even if the method was wrong. Crane acknowledged that didn't make it right. Hartford agreed, but said it made it complicated. And complicated was more honest than simple. Horses start walking, leather creaking, hooves on packed earth. Hartford explained where they were going. North to Colorado Territory, a town that was having trouble with rustlers and needed a deputy. The sheriff was old and willing to take a chance on Crane if Hartford vouched for him. Crane asked cautiously if Hartford really would vouch for him. The marshal said he would. But this time, Crane had to do it by the book. No deals, no arrangements, just honest law work, however messy that got. Crane laughed quietly, saying it would be strange being on the right side of everything. Hartford replied that the right side was rarely comfortable. That's how you knew it was right. Wind blowing across open plains, saddles creaking rhythmically. As they rode north, the sun setting behind them, one era ended and another began. Redemption Creek got a new sheriff, a by-the-book man who ran things straight. Crime returned, as it always does, but so did something else. Accountability, transparency, the messy, difficult work of real justice. Years later, people would debate whether William Crane was a hero or a villain. The truth, like most truths, lives somewhere in the gray space between. He was a man who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. He protected the innocent by compromising with the guilty. He bought peace with corruption and saved lives through lies. On that long ride north, Crane reflected aloud on what he'd learned. There were no clean answers out here in the West. It didn't deal in absolute right and wrong. It dealt in survival, in choices between bad and worse. Hartford considered this, then said maybe that was true, but they had to keep trying anyway. Keep trying to build something better than what Crane asked if Hartford thought they ever would. The marshal told him to ask again in 20 years. Gentle wind, distant coyote howl. History remembers the famous outlaws and the legendary lawmen, but it often forgets the men like William Crane, who lived in the shadows between. He spent the rest of his life in that Colorado town, serving quietly, honestly, never speaking of his past unless pressed. He died in 1911, at the age of 63, with his boots off and his conscience as clear as he could make it. Church bells tolling slowly, train whistle in the distance. At his funeral, something unexpected happened. A woman arrived on the train from Albuquerque. Maria Cortez, decades removed from her outlaw days, now a respectable businesswoman. She placed a single white flower on his grave and whispered her thanks. Thanks for giving them a chance to be more than what they were. Footsteps on grass, wind through cemetery trees. In the end, perhaps that was William Crane's real legacy. Not the corruption or the compromise, but the belief that people could change. That redemption wasn't just a name on a town sign, but a possibility worth protecting, even at great cost to oneself. The town of Redemption Creek still exists today, though most who live there don't know the full truth of their history. The schoolhouse still stands. The church bell still rings. And sometimes on quiet desert nights, old-timers tell stories of a sheriff who kept them safe, though they disagree on whether he was the best lawman they ever had, or the most dangerous criminal who never got caught. Maybe he was both. Maybe that's the only way it could have been. Wind fading, silence settling over the empty desert.